Hey everybody, we're back. I can only record for 15 minutes at a time, so let's pick up where we left off. I was talking about how it's your job in the introduction to state the problem that you're dealing with or your research interest and defend why you're talking about it. Why is it important? So, leaving off with, or picking up where I left off, you want to explain what gaps in the literature you're hoping to fill. What have you identified as something we need to know more about as an academic and a community in general? So, you start by talking about the significance of your issue or your area of interest, but then the artifacts themselves. Why should we study advertising campaigns or sports coverage or how music affects mental health and how we can apply that to mental health outreach over mass media platforms, right? You're going to have to explain that to us. And that's part of that motivation piece, to motivate your reader to become involved. And it also relates the reader to your content and tells them, here's what you might already be familiar with, and here's where I'm going with this. Sell yourself well, right? You've worked really hard on this. You have interesting things to say. So grab your reader from the beginning. All right. And then finally, you're going to lay out the organization of your paper as a roadmap to where we're going. So what does your essay do? What research questions is it going to answer? All right. So let me break down what I have laid out in front of you here. You do this preview with a thesis and preview. So your thesis statement is going to be the overarching argument you're going to make for the whole paper. So these media messages do X in society, or this advertisement has the power to do X, Y, and Z according to these theories. All right. I'm going to give you lots of great examples of thesis and previews that you can mimic for your own project. So, basically with your introduction, you're laying out the consequences of not addressing a problem or what you hope to do with your project, and the thesis and preview lays out exactly what is going on. So I encourage you first to lay out your thesis. What is your thesis going to argue? Thesis keywords might include, I argue in what follows that X, Y, and Z, or I contend, I find that the following things are happening. Right? So just one claim about what's going on and what you've observed. So I examine Donald Trump's speech through a narrative perspective, and I argue that he tells a story that his constituents can grab onto using this theory. Then in your preview, you can break it down more specifically. You can say, specifically, my thesis is organized into these following components. So you want to lay out, I'm about to lay out the literature review of all the scholarship that came before my scholarship. I'm going to lay out the method of analysis. Then I'll move into my analysis that answers this research question. And I'll go into some limitations and conclusions based on this research. So some keywords that you might see in your preview are, this thesis is organized into particular sections or 4 major areas. First, I do this. Second, I do this. Then I do that. All right? This way, again, you're guiding your reader along with you. So let's look at some examples that I created myself. Okay. Whoops. So you can access these slides. So if you want to mimic some of the wording here, but let's pretend that my thesis statement for my thesis is the following. Presidents are known to persuade their audiences through relatable stories. I argue that Donald Trump's speech presents a narrative of freedom through economic prosperity, which helps him identify with his supporters. So that's the overarching claim I'm going to make for the whole thesis, and then I want to preview each section for my reader. So in what follows, I examine Donald Trump's speech through a narrative perspective and through Burke's theory of identification. You see how I've previewed my method right there? Specifically, I turn to the works of Walter Fisher and other scholars who have illustrated the use of narrative theory to understand cultural phenomena. Then I engage Burke's theory of identification to explain how speakers connect with their constituents through highlighting their shared goals and values. All right, so presumably my argument will be two-part. I'll talk about how narrative theory can help explain the cultural phenomena of a presidential speech like this one, and then I'll talk about the theory of identity and how Trump uses certain language to appeal to what he thinks are shared goals and values with his constituents. All right, here's a different example of a preview that you could take with your specific content woven in. To support this argument, this thesis is divided into three parts. First, I briefly review key theories that inform this project, including media effects, uses and gratifications theory, and feminist theory. Second, I offer my analysis, wherein I demonstrate how the movie Star Wars Episode 6 Return of the Jedi tells a story of redemption to absolve people of their own guilt. Finally, I end with a review of these arguments and pose suggestions for further research. So, this preview has laid out every move that I'm going to make in my thesis, and it's essential that you have this roadmap for your readers in one paragraph toward the end of your introduction section. All right, so think about how to write your own mimicking these examples to preview your content. I hope that's clear. I'm going to move on to another example, a more scholarly example, so you can see how this plays out in actual scholarship. So if you haven't heard about the Guerrilla Girls, they are a funny feminist group that uses humor and graphic art to argue for better women's representation. So they studied, A.T. Demo studied how the Guerrilla Girls used messaging to subvert sexist practices in famous art museums. So they sort of played on this painting right here, which is a famous nude, and they put a gorilla mask on it because they're the Guerrilla Girls. They often have a lot of gorilla imagery. And they argue, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art section are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. So they're going to examine this, or this author examines the Guerrilla Girls campaign for greater female artist representation. So this is kind of wordy, what we're about to read, but I want you to zero in on the components of the introduction of this article. Okay, so here is an introduction, long introduction, but basically when you see the words, I argue that the organizing logic for these strategies in particular, and Guerrilla Girls rhetoric in general, is the technique that Burke labels perspective by incongruity. Okay, so without knowing what any of those things are, when you see the words, I argue, what do you think the author is laying out right here? I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. I argue is going to be her thesis statement. All right, this is the major claim that she's making. And she follows this claim up by saying, here's why I am focusing on strategies of incongruity. All right, and so she goes on, she kind of has a very long thesis statement. The second thing she says here that I want to point out is the Guerrilla Girls rhetoric then demonstrates how planned incongruity not only pokes fun at the failures of social structure, but also offers a comic corrective to such failings. Again, you don't have to know what any of that means. All I'm pointing out is that she has a solid thesis statement here, which if you're familiar with any of these terms, you're going to have a sense of what she's trying to argue. Alrighty, let's look at another example of a preview. So this whole thing is a preview, but let's go through each component. This essay unfolds in 4 sections. So as a reader, I'm going to be looking for those 4 sections. I begin with a brief overview of the feminist art activism as it bears most directly on Guerrilla Girls rhetoric, while highlighting feminist antecedents and cultural pretexts for the group's formation. So she's going to overview or provide a literature review there of the Guerrilla Girls rhetoric, what they've said before, feminist theory, and cultural theory. All right? So she's previewed her methods, her literature review right there. The second section examines the conceptual linkages between feminist rhetoric, perspective by incongruity, and the comic frame. Here is her methods section. All right, she's going to apply a frame of feminist rhetoric, perspective by incongruity, and the comic frame, whatever that means. But this is a preview of her method section. Those are the 3 methods she's going to use. With me so far? I hope. There's not a lot of nonverbal feedback available in this teaching format, but hopefully this is clear. Next, the analysis that follows features 3 strategies of incongruity. Okay, without even reading further, which part of her thesis is she previewing here? Her analysis, right? She tells us here are her arguments. Okay, there are 3 strategies of incongruity that the Guerrilla Girls are using to persuade their audience and grab people's attention. All right, I won't read the rest there. You can read it on your own. Finally, she says, I conclude by discussing the potential for unconventional forms of persuasion to enact social change. So that is ultimately the conclusion and the implication that she's going to elaborate upon in her conclusion. So you can see in this paragraph, she's previewed 4 parts of her argument. And I want you to do the same thing for your thesis in your introduction with your thesis statement and preview. All right? So I hope that gives you a good sense of what's required for your introduction. Now let's talk about the conclusion. Your conclusion should be several paragraphs to a few pages. All right? And your job is to do these 4 things. First, explain the significance of your thesis. So you might start by restating your main claim or your main thesis. In this project, I have demonstrated X, Y, and Z. All right? And then you're going to remind us about what your thesis has offered in particular, why this was such an important argument to make. All right? You're going to toot your own horn here because you should. You've done a lot of hard work. So you want to remind us of your thesis, your goals for the project, and your key findings and how you met the goals of your project. What did you uncover? Synthesize that information for us. Then take a paragraph or 2 to lay out the limitations. What were you unable to do in this short time? You weren't able to look at every possible example of advertisements that you wanted to. You were limited to a handful of case studies when you think looking at a lot more would be beneficial. Whatever you can think of, it's okay to say, there's more to be said here. I only am scratching the surface. And here are some directions. Here's how other scholars can take this up. All right, what else is left to be said or expanded upon? Did any questions come up in your work that made you feel like, if I had more time, I would keep exploring? Put that in this section. And finally, end with some concluding last lines or key takeaways for your reader. So, what's the big deal? Answer the so what here. All right, tell us, why does this all matter? If you're passionate about it, then you should be able to articulate why we should be passionate and excited about this too. All right, so a couple more tips for your conclusion section. I've gone over this a little bit already. Always ask and answer the question, so what? Why does this all matter in the end? What I want you to avoid in your conclusion is introducing any new information that wasn't covered in the bulk of your thesis in your argument section. If you're providing new quotes and evidence that belong in the body of the paper, move them up. This is not your place to surprise us with new information. This is a synthesis of what you covered. I also want you to avoid boring endings like, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. The 1 paragraph conclusion, all right? The Sherlock Holmes is where you don't give anything away. You leave your audience guessing, all right? It's a dramatic choice, but it's not going to work well. I want you to be explicit about what you're saying in your thesis. And I'm going to stop here because the recording's going to end and I'll pick back up in just a second.